Here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul has been describing how he desires that what is he calls a building of God, a house not made with hands. What's he talking about? He's talking about the resurrected body that's going to be changed, fit to dwell in heaven. And as we noted, sometimes we read that and we think, well, Paul's talking about heaven, a building of God, a house not made with hands. Not exactly. He's talking about dwelling in heaven, but specifically he's talking about desiring that new body that God is going to give us for the purpose of dwelling in heaven at the resurrection. We studied back in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, at the resurrection, the physical body will be raised, but it'll be changed. It'll be a spiritual body as we enter into eternity at that point. But Paul describes how he desires that. In verse 2, he describes how he's groaning, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon, using that terminology, to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven, that or heavenly body, changed body, groaning for that, greatly desiring it. And then we noted in verse 3 how Paul didn't want to be found without that clothing. And it was mentioned, brought up last, Sunday, I guess, how I initially said that Paul had been talking about the two clothings, the physical body that we have right now on this earth, and then the new changed spiritual body fit for heaven, fit for eternity at the resurrection. And it was mentioned that some didn't read verse 3 the same way, as it looked to me like he had desired not to be without one of those, not to be found naked. I promised that I would go back and look at it, and I did, and I'm kind of doubling down. I think it means what I said it meant Sunday. But because in the context, he's talking about those two clothings, being clothed the physical body, and versus being clothed with that eternal spiritual body, that building of God. And the King James here in verse 3 says, if so be that being clothed, we shall not be found naked. And I guess that the way that reads makes it a little bit difficult, for some anyway. But if you look at other translations, some will actually say, since we're clothed, we won't be found naked. In other words, because of this, and some translations use the word because there. Because being clothed with one or the other, we won't be found naked. He doesn't want to be in that in-between state. That's what it looks like to me for some reason. I don't know why. Because if that in-between state is what it looks like it could be to me, the period of the Hadean realm, because that's the only place where you don't have either a physical body or the resurrected changed body, is if you die and you're in the Hadean realm, the waiting place, waiting for the Christ to come back. But it's a mystery to me why Paul wouldn't want that, because it's still paradise. So I don't know. But I don't know. I'm not 100% sure what else he could be talking about, or what that fits the context and the terminology that he's been using to stay consistent with the terminology. But continuing there, he continues to describe, and verse 4 is basically repeats verse 2 with just a little more information there, a little more explanation of what he's talking about, but still groaning for that eternal body, that body fit for heaven. We left off about verse 6, so I'm going to read from verse 6 on down to verse 10. Therefore, we are always confident, knowing that, whilst we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Wherefore we labor that whether present or absent, we may be accepted of Him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that every one may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. And we'll pause there. Okay, so backing up to verse 6, he says, we are always confident. even while groaning, even while desiring that changed heavenly body, we're still confident. We still have great courage. And going back to what terminology that I used in chapter 4, verse 16, we don't faint. We don't quit. We don't give up. We're looking forward with great anticipation, yes, desiring for what the Lord has promised us, and groaning for in wanting to have that, but we're confident in this life too, having good courage at this life. And he says also in verse 6, we're at home, whilst at home in the body, we're absent from the Lord. And I asked the question, I think, as we just touched verse 6 just a little bit, didn't really go into it Sunday, but I closed by asking the question, aren't we with the Lord even in this life? Or you could say it the other way, isn't the Lord with us? Even in this, so what does Paul mean? Well, whilst at home in the body, living in this physical life, we're absent from the Lord. What does he mean by that? Well, is there a sense in which we can be at home somewhere but not be completely at home at the same time? For example, I travel a lot. Y'all know that. I go over different countries a lot. In January, I'll be back in India like I've been pretty much every year for a while now. And the brethren there are very welcoming. They do their best and they want me to feel welcome, feel at home. And in many ways I do. But am I completely at home there? Well, no. And I think that's not exactly a parallel, but I think that gives us a rough idea maybe of what Paul's talking about. We're at home in the body, but at the same time, we're recognize this is a temporary dwelling in our physical bodies. It's like living abroad. Yes, you feel at home, but you're not really at home in many ways. And in that sense, absent from the Lord. Yes, of course, there is a sense in which the Lord is with us now. And especially as we're doing His work. In fact, what did He say? What did Jesus say in Matthew 28, verse 20? You remember it? He gave the Great Commission to His apostles there to go and teach others to do as they've been instructed, which is also to teach. So the Great Commission applies to us. But then after that, at the very end of that, what did He say in verse 20? As they're going and doing this, what? I'll be with you. I'll be with you. Say again? Right, finishing out the verse there. Even at the end of the world or the end of the age is the idea there. So yes, there's a sense in which the Lord will be with us. I think that promise applies to us too. Now, not necessarily in the same sense exactly as it did with the apostles, because the apostles had, miraculous abilities, and the Lord was with them in that way. We don't have that, but there's a sense in which the Lord will be with us as we're doing His work as well. But when we are in eternity, when we have that changed body, a spiritual body fit for dwelling in heaven, there's a new sense that we're in the presence of the Lord now. Yes, He's with us now. But when we enter into eternity, there's a new sense that the Lord is with us and we're in His presence. I think that's what Paul's talking about. We're at home on this earth. We hear what we have, and we're confident in living for the Lord while we're here. But in a sense, we're absent from the Lord because we haven't entered into that eternal dwelling place with Him just yet. Questions, comments? Verse 7. For we walk by faith, not by sight. He states it this way: walk by faith, not by sight. Go back to chapter 4 and verse 18, because I think what he says in chapter 4, verse 18 means the same thing as chapter 5, verse 7, but he says it in a different way. Chapter 4, verse 18 says, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Now, you think about that concept, and that's exactly what walking by faith and not by sight means. We have not entered into the eternal presence of the Lord just yet. And so we haven't yet seen heaven. We have not yet experienced heaven. But we can have faith that the Lord is real, that heaven is real, and that we have a promise, that we can a guarantee, a surety from the Lord. If we're faithful to Him, we will be there with Him. But we haven't seen it yet. So we walk by faith and not by sight. In fact, what did the Hebrews writer, how did he define faith? Hebrews 11, verse 1. The evidence of things not seen. If you have something in your hand, you can see it, you can touch it, you can smell it, or whatever. Okay, you don't have faith in that because it's in your hands right there, right? But if you have evidence but haven't seen and touched it, but you still have evidence that it exists, okay, that's faith. The evidence of things not seen. It's not a blind leap. It's not something that, well, I just believe in this, but I don't have really any evidence. That's not faith. The evidence of things hoped for, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So we walk by faith. I haven't seen this resurrected body. I haven't seen heaven in which that resurrected body will dwell, but I walk by faith, not by sight. While at home in the body, in this physical world, and absent from the Lord, I still have faith, even though I haven't seen what comes after this. But I have faith in it. Questions, comments? Verse 8, we are confident. Same word he used back there in verse 6. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and present with the Lord. Paul, he's described in previous chapters, and he'll describe in the coming chapters as well, as he defends himself and his apostleship and the things that he said as being true and what he'd endured for the faith. He's described his suffering. He's described those things that he's endured for the cause of Christ. And that was heavy on him, no doubt. But he was willing to endure those sufferings of this life as long as necessary. Yes, ma'am. I'm not 100% sure on that. Verse 7 you're talking about. Yeah. Of course, I've got the King James as well, and mine is also in parentheses. I don't know. Sorry, I'm not sure about that. Why it would be. This additional information to what, it's not like in the sentence, but an additional point of the sentence. I don't know. What are the thoughts, questions? So Paul, going into verse 8 again, Paul was confident. He was willing to endure and be absent from the Lord. In other words, or absent from the body and present with the Lord. But he was enduring and confident in this life, waiting for that ultimate presence with the Lord. Willing to endure sufferings of this life as long as necessary. But also confidently anticipating that heavenly body, that spiritual body, eternal body, that body fit for heaven that was promised and was to come. and then being in the actual presence of the Lord. Greatly anticipating that. This passage, as Paul talks about this, being here on this earth, absent from the Lord in a sense, versus a desire to be present with the Lord, those concepts also remind me of Philippians 1, verses 21 to 24. Let's go over there and read that real quick. Philippians 1, verses 21 to 24. Of course, this is also the Apostle Paul. He says, "For me to live is Christ, to die is gain." Now, wait a minute. What does that mean? To live is Christ and to die is gain? We don't have time to dig into that real deep, but what does that mean? When Paul was on this earth, what was his purpose? What was his goal? To bring others to Christ, to teach Christ, to teach and preach Christ. But to die is gain. Mm-hmm. And go into the presence of the Lord in that sense. Similar to the concept of that we were over in 2 Corinthians 5 there. The death of a Christian is a gain. Now, for those of us who are still on this earth, we feel a loss there because that person is no longer here with us. But for that person, if they're faithful, that's not a loss, that's a gain. Paul recognized that, and he talked about it that way. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor, yet what I shall choose, I wot not, or I know not. He doesn't know which one to choose. Not that he's gonna, intentionally go into death, but he knows he has a desire to be here to do some things, but there's a great desire to be with the Lord too. Go to verse 23. For I am in a strait betwixt two. What does that word strait mean? S-T-R-A-I-T. No G-H in there. Yeah. It's a narrow, difficult place. That's what a strait is. You hear you hear that word used sometimes of waterways. It's not exact same thing here, but it gives the same idea. It's a narrow, difficult place between two difficult spots, a difficult decision. Having a desire to depart, to die and go be with the Lord and be with Christ, which is far better, verse 24. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. I'm trying to help you in your spiritual lives, but I have a great desire to leave this earth and go be with the Lord. Same idea over here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Questions, comments? Verse 9. Wherefore we labor, that whether present or absent, we may be accepted of Him. We labor. Some translations say we make it our aim. Our labor. We make it our aim. It's our goal. The word that translated labor there literally means to fully exert oneself. To put the utmost effort into. To earnestly endeavor. And he says, the King James says, wherefore we labor. Earnestly endeavor. For what? Whether present or absent, whether we're here on this earth, or we leave this earth, or you can say it the other way around, whatever condition we're in, whichever clothing that we have, our goal, our work, our earnest endeavor is to do what? To be accepted of Him, of the Lord, of God. In both situations, in this life and after this life, the endeavor, the goal is to be accepted. King James Version says accepted. Some translations say well-pleasing to the Lord. It's like somebody read Romans 14, verse 8 for me real quick. Romans 14, verse 8. All right. So we are to be His no matter what. No matter what situation we find ourselves in this life, or if our lives on this earth come to an end, wherever we find ourselves, be the Lord's. Belong to Him. And that should be our chief concern in this life. To be pleasing to the Lord. To be accepted, as the King James says. But well-pleasing. I think that's something that we need to remind ourselves of every day. Our goal in this life is to be well-pleasing to Him. And the day that we die, be well-pleasing to the Lord. And the thing is, we don't know the day that we're going to die. So every day of our lives, the goal should be well-pleasing to God. And we know that one day our lives on this earth will come to an end, whether it's through death or whether it's through Christ coming back and we're changed at that point. One day our lives on this earth will come to an end. So the goal should be, when that day comes, be found well-pleasing to God. Because when that moment comes, whenever it is, what else matters? Besides being well-pleasing to God, when our lives on this earth is over with, what else matters besides whether or not we were pleasing to God? Say again? Okay. And that's directly associated with being well-pleasing to the Lord, isn't it? Absolutely it is. It's not going to matter what kind of job we had, how big our house was, what kind of car we drove, how many people liked us in the community, whatever. None of that's going to matter. Whether or not we were faithful to the Lord. That's all that's going to matter. Questions, comments? Let's go into verse 10. This verse 10 is a verse that I think most of us are very familiar with. We've heard and read many, many times. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body, according that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. All these things that Paul's been talking about, having this desire to be with the Lord, but also at home in this life as he's continuing to work for the Lord and trying to do his best work as he can for the Lord, but having that great desire. And as he said over in Philippians, I'm in a strait betwixt two, wanting to do both, to help you stay here and help you with your spiritual lives, but also go home and be with the Lord. And groaning, as he describes in this text, groaning for that spiritual body, having a great desire for it. These thoughts brought Paul's mind to the judgment. There's going to be a time when all of us stand before the Lord. And is that going to be a good day or a bad day? All of those things brought this to Paul's mind. So we've got to put every effort into what he said in verse 9, being accepted of God, well-pleasing to God. Because there's going to be a day coming when we're going to be rewarded by the way that we lived. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. We make that decision, whether that's a good day or a bad day. Sometimes we put it as if, it's God making the decision. No, we made the decision. God just gives the final sentence. We make the decision by the way that we live. Good or bad. Right? And that word appear, in verse 10 there, for we must all appear, it means to be made known. We've seen that word and a concept or similar words used previously in this letter. Sometimes it's the word manifest. We've seen that word multiple times. It means to reveal, to make known. And that's the same thing, same concept here. We must all appear. We're going to be made known before the judgment seat of Christ. And how many? For we must what? All appear before the judgment seat of Christ. I got 4 passages here. If some folks want to take turns reading concerning this concept of all. The Bible refers to it. It says the word all right here in this text, and then it refers to it in different ways in other texts as well. So I want to go take note of them because there's no exceptions. Four verses here. Romans 14, verse 12. It's Romans 14, 12. Then Matthew 25, 32. Acts 17, 31. And then 1 Peter 4, verse 5. Let's read each of those verses and notice how this concept of all is referred to in different ways. Who's got Romans 14, verse 12?
So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God.
All right, thank you, sir. So every one of us, same concept, isn't it? We have the word all here in 2 Corinthians 5, and every one of us over in Romans 14. And every one of us is going to do what?
Give account.
Give account. And that's the same idea as we're going to receive the thing He's done in our body, good or bad. We're going to give account. Same idea. Who's got Matthew 25, 32? Thank you, sir. So in Matthew 25, of course, this is a judgment scene, a picture of the final judgment. And who is gathered before Him? All nations. Not just the Jews. Certainly not just Americans. But all nations gathered before Him. And they're going to be divided, sheep and goats. Acts 17, verse 31. All right, thank you, ma'am. So, who is it here in this text? The world. So that includes everybody, doesn't it? It's the world gathered, receiving judgment. And it's going to be based upon Christ, the one who is risen from the dead. This judgment is. All right, one more verse, 1 Peter 4 and verse 5. Who's going to give account? 2 groups here mentioned. The living and the dead. Some translations, I think King James says quick and the dead. Quick meaning living, of course. The living and the dead. Those who are still living when Christ comes back, going to give account. Those who have already died, going to give account. All people, from Adam and Eve, all the way up to the people that are living when Christ makes His final return. I don't know who that'll be. Could be us, might not be. I don't know. But all will give account when Christ returns. And receive the things, going back to 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10, that everyone, each one that's appearing before the judgment seat of Christ, is going to receive the things done in his body, the things which he practiced, the way that we live. Where the sentence we receive is based on how we live. And it specifically says, in his body, the way that we live in this physical life. You know, and I point that out because some have ideas that, you know, there might be a second chance after we die. But our judgment is based on how the things that we do when? In this body. When we're clothed with the physical body, to keep that, use the terminology in the context here. So when this life is over with, when we die, when we pass from this life, our chance to impact that judgment is over with. It's the things that we've done how we've lived our lives on this earth. That's going to determine what the judgment is that we receive, good or bad. But somebody says, well, what about grace? Isn't God going to just cover with all those bad things? Won't those just be covered by God's grace? God's grace is great and powerful, wonderful. But whether or not we receive some aspects of God's grace, it depends on us. Now, there's a sense, and we're going to receive God's grace in some ways, no matter what. All of us receive the rain, right? See what I did there? But that's God's grace. He's blessing us in many ways. All of us receive God's blessings in many ways. And God has given us, through His grace, He's given us all the opportunity for salvation through Jesus. But whether or not we have that grace is dependent on us. Whether or not we give ourselves to Him. How we live in this physical life. His grace is dependent in some aspects, not in every aspect, but in some aspects, His grace is dependent on how we live, whether or not we receive it. Questions, comments? Say again now. Let the sale pass by. But it says good or bad. That word bad, from what I understand, carries an idea of worthless. That's powerful. And you take that concept to the next level of thought there. If we live a life that is not well-pleasing to God, that is a life that is not accepted by God, in the end, when this life is over with, what was that worth? It wasn't worth anything. That's that word worthless. That's an interesting thought. Because human life is precious. We're made in the very image of God. But in the end, if we don't live our lives for God, that's a meaningless life. As I said earlier, in this class, when this life is over with, all that's going to matter is whether or not I've been pleasing to God. That's all that will matter.